When Americans think of June 1944, our minds immediately jump to the beaches of Normandy. We picture the Higgins boats, the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, and the brutal fight through the hedgerows of France. But while the Western Allies were grinding their way inland against a handful of German divisions, an apocalyptic storm was gathering 1,500 miles to the east. The Soviet Union was about to unleash a mechanized juggernaut of 2.5 million men, 6,000 tanks, and 7,000 aircraft against the very heart of the German Wehrmacht. This was Operation Bagration. In just 6 weeks, it would completely obliterate 28 German divisions, tearing a hole 400 miles wide in the Eastern Front. It was the single greatest defeat in German military history, dwarfing even the catastrophe at Stalingrad. If you want to understand how a modern, mechanized army executes a deep operational encirclement, you need to study what happened in the swamps of Belarus in the summer of 1944. Welcome back to the channel, where we dissect the tactics, the logistics, and the brutal realities of mechanized warfare. Before we get into the operational maps, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments below, what do you consider the most successful military deception operation in history? Is it Operation Bodyguard before D-Day? Or is it what the Soviets pulled off right here? Let us dive into the strategic nightmare that set the stage for Bagration. To understand the sheer scale of the violence that erupted on June 22, 1944, we have to rewind the clock. We cannot just look at the frontline traces of that summer. We have to look at the evolution of Soviet military thought, a doctrine born in the chaotic aftermath of the Russian Civil War. In the 1920s and 30s, Soviet theorists like Mikhail Tukhachevsky developed a concept called deep battle. Unlike the rigid, linear trench warfare of World War I, deep battle envisioned breaking through the enemy defensive belts and immediately injecting highly mobile armored formations into the operational depth. The goal was not just to push the enemy back, but to paralyze their nervous system, destroying command posts, severing supply lines, and collapsing the entire defensive structure simultaneously. Think of it like the American air-land battle doctrine that completely dismantled the Iraqi army in Operation Desert Storm, but conceived 60 years earlier and executed with raw industrial brutality. However, this brilliant doctrine was decapitated before it could be tested. Stalin purges in the late 1930s wiped out the brightest minds of the Red Army officer corps. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Red Army was a massive, clumsy beast. It had thousands of tanks, but no radios. It had millions of men, but officers who were paralyzed by fear of the secret police. The Germans, practicing their fast-paced maneuver warfare, sliced through Soviet lines, taking millions of prisoners. The Red Army learned its trade the hard way, paying for every tactical lesson with rivers of blood. By 1944, the dynamic had completely shifted. The clumsy beast had evolved into an apex predator. The surviving Soviet commanders, men like Georgy Zhukov, Alexander Vasilevsky, and Konstantin Rokossovsky, had survived the crucible of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk. They had mastered the art of operational warfare, the critical link between battlefield tactics and grand strategy. By the late spring of 1944, the strategic situation for Nazi Germany was deteriorating rapidly. The Allies had captured Rome on June 4th. 2 days later, Operation Overlord kicked off in Normandy. Hitler was fighting a multi-front war, exactly what German military academies had warned against for a century. But the German High Command remained obsessively focused on the southern sector of the Eastern Front. They looked at the map and saw the Soviet forces massed in Ukraine. The German intelligence apparatus, completely compromised and suffering from severe confirmation bias, convinced Hitler that the next major Soviet summer offensive would strike south, aiming for the Balkans and the vital Romanian oil fields. They were dead wrong. The Soviets were looking straight down the highway to Minsk, aiming directly at Army Group Center in Belarus. How do you hide 2.5 million men and 6,000 tanks from an enemy that has been fighting you for 3 years? You do not just camouflage them. You feed the enemy exactly what they want to believe. The Soviet deception plan, known as Maskirovka, was a masterpiece of operational security. They built dummy tank concentrations in the south. They maintained strict radio silence in the central sector. Trains moved only at night, and troops were forbidden from lighting fires, even as temperatures dropped. The Germans flew reconnaissance missions over the Belarusian forests and saw nothing but trees. Meanwhile, the reality on the ground was terrifying. Let us break down the numbers and the hardware, because warfare at this level is a math problem, and the Germans were on the wrong side of the equation. Defending the Belarusian salient was German Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Ernst Busch. Busch was a loyalist to Hitler, a man who followed orders rather than arguing for operational flexibility. He had roughly 800,000 men under his command, spread across 4 armies. These were the 3rd Panzer Army, the 4th Army, the 9th Army, and the 2nd Army. On paper, 800,000 men sounds like a formidable force. But military analysis requires looking past the raw headcount. These divisions were hollowed out. A standard German infantry division in 1944 was supposed to have around 12,000 men, but many in Army Group Center were fighting with barely half that number. Their equipment was a logistical nightmare of captured weapons, horse-drawn artillery, and worn-out rifles. Worse still, Army Group Center had been stripped of its armor. Believing the attack would come in the south, the German High Command had transferred almost all their heavy panzer divisions to Army Group North Ukraine. Busch was left with exactly 1 fully equipped panzer division, the 20th Panzer, and a handful of assault gun brigades. He had roughly 500 tanks and assault guns to cover a front line that stretched for over 400 miles. That is barely over 1 armored vehicle per mile of front. Contrast that with the defense in depth the Soviets built at Kursk a year earlier, and you start to see the impending disaster. The tactical doctrine imposed on these German troops was suicidal. Hitler had issued his infamous Feste Plätze, or fortified places, order. Cities like Vitebsk, Orsha, and Bobruisk were designated as fortresses. The commanders were ordered to hold these cities to the last man, forbidding any tactical retreats. This rigid, static defense was the exact opposite of the elastic defense doctrine that German officers had perfected. By anchoring their forces to these cities, the Germans willingly placed their necks in the guillotine. They were giving up their greatest remaining asset, which was the tactical skill and mobility of the average German soldier, and forcing them to sit in trenches, waiting for the artillery to fall. And the artillery was coming. Facing this brittle German shell were 4 massive Soviet fronts, which are the equivalent of Western army groups. From north to south, these were the 1st Baltic Front under Bagration, the 3rd Belarusian under Cherniakovsky, the 2nd Belarusian under Zakharov, and the 1st Belarusian under Rokossovsky. Together, they fielded 118 rifle divisions, 8 tank and mechanized corps, and 13 artillery divisions. We are talking about 2.5 million soldiers. But infantry alone does not win a mechanized war. The muscle of this offensive was its armor. The Soviets amassed over 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. The spearhead of this armoured armada was the newly upgraded T-34-85. Let us talk about this machine for a second, because it changed the tactical calculus on the battlefield. The original T-34 was a revolutionary design in 1941, but by 1943 its 76mm gun was struggling to penetrate the frontal armour of German Tigers and Panthers. The Soviets responded by fitting a massive new turret housing an 85mm anti-aircraft gun. This new tank weighed 32 tons and could hit 33 miles per hour on road. Its 85mm gun could punch through 4 inches of armour at 1,000 yards. While it still could not go toe-to-toe with a heavy Tiger tank in a long-range sniper duel, it did not have to. The Soviets had them in overwhelming numbers, and they had the speed to flank the heavy German cats. Supporting the medium tanks were the heavy beast killers, the Su-152 and ISU-152 self-propelled guns. Firing a massive 100-pound high-explosive shell, these assault guns did not even need to penetrate a tank armour. The sheer kinetic energy of a direct hit would spall the armour on the inside, killing the crew, or literally blow the turret completely off the hull ring of a German Panther. But having tanks is useless if you cannot fuel them, arm them, and keep them moving. This brings us to the unsung hero of Operation Bagration and a piece of American history deeply woven into the Eastern Front. I'm talking about logistics, specifically the Studebaker US 6.5-ton truck. Through the Lend-Lease program, the United States shipped over 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union. The Soviet industrial base was entirely focused on building tanks, artillery, and aircraft. They outsourced their logistical mobility to Detroit. The Studebaker was a rugged, reliable beast with a 6-wheel drive configuration that could handle the infamous Russian mud season. These trucks gave the Red Army something it had never possessed before, which was operational-level mobility. In previous offensives, Soviet tanks would break through the German lines, advance 40 or 50 miles, and then run out of gas and ammunition because their horse-drawn supply trains could not keep up. The Germans would then counterattack and destroy the stranded tanks. Not anymore. With the Studebakers, the Soviet motorized infantry and supply columns could keep pace with the advancing armor. They could sustain a deep drive, extending hundreds of miles into the enemy rear. It was a logistical revolution on par with General Sherman marched to the sea during the American Civil War, but mechanized and moving at 30 miles per hour. To crack the German fortified cities, the Soviets assembled an artillery park of apocalyptic proportions. They brought up over 24,000 artillery pieces and heavy mortars. In the breakthrough sectors, the concentration of firepower reached over 320 guns per mile of front line. That means there was an artillery piece every 16 feet. The logistical effort to stockpile the ammunition for this barrage is mind-bending. Soviet trains moved over 1.2 million tons of supplies into the staging areas. They laid down thousands of miles of new rail lines and repaired hundreds of bridges destroyed by the retreating Germans in previous years. Above the battlefield, the Red Air Force had achieved total air supremacy. The Soviet aviation armies deployed over 7,000 aircraft, including the heavily armoured Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes. The German Luftwaffe, bled dry by the combined bomber offensive over Germany and the invasion of Normandy, could muster barely 600 operational aircraft in the sector. The German infantryman, who had enjoyed the protection of the Stuka dive bombers in 1941, was now completely exposed to the wrath of the Sturmoviks. Why did the Germans fail to see this logistical mountain being built right in front of them? Part of it was the Maskirovka deception, but another massive factor was the terrain. The operational area was dominated by the Pripyat marshes and the dense Belarusian forests. This is a miserable, waterlogged landscape, roughly the size of the state of Ohio. The Germans considered this terrain impassable for large armored formations. They looked at the swamps and assumed the Soviets could only attack with light infantry. It is a classic military blunder, assuming the environment limits your enemy exactly as it limits you. The Soviets, however, had spent months preparing. Engineers cut down millions of trees to build corduroy roads, laying logs side by side across the swamps. They constructed underwater bridges, keeping the road surface a few inches below the water level, so German reconnaissance flights could not spot them. Infantrymen wove massive mats of branches and reeds to lay over the mud, allowing the 32-ton tanks to literally float over the bogs. They were preparing to strike exactly where the Germans thought an attack was physically impossible. By the evening of June 21, 1944, the trap was fully set. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers lay hidden in the forests and swamps, gripping their submachine guns and waiting for the flare. 3 years earlier, on June 22, 1941, Hitler had launched Operation Barbarossa, tearing the Soviet Union apart in a surprise attack. Now, on the exact 3-year anniversary of that invasion, the Red Army was preparing to return the favor with interest. The German sentries in their trench lines stared out into the dark Belarusian woods, unaware that they were looking into the barrel of the largest concentration of artillery in human history. The silence of the night was about to be shattered by a storm of steel that would erase an entire German army group from the map. At 0500 hours on June 22, 1944, the earth itself seemed to fracture. The silence of the Belarusian dawn was shattered by the simultaneous roar of over 24,000 Soviet artillery pieces, heavy mortars, and multiple rocket launchers. This was not a standard preliminary bombardment like the ones the Western Allies were using in Normandy. This was an orchestrated symphony of annihilation, a rolling barrage designed to completely vaporize the first 2 lines of the German defensive network. To understand the sheer kinetic horror of this event, we have to look at the hardware delivering the payload. The backbone of this bombardment was the Soviet 152mm ML-20 howitzer. Firing a 95-pound high-explosive fragmentation shell, this gun could lob death over 10 miles away. When a shell of that size detonates, it does not just send shrapnel tearing through flesh and wood. It creates a massive overpressure wave, a concussive blast that turns the internal organs of anyone within 50 yards to jelly, even if they are hiding inside a log bunker. The Germans had spent months building deep trench systems, interlocking machine gun nests, and reinforced concrete pillboxes. In a matter of minutes, these positions were pulverized into a moonscape of smoking craters. But the conventional artillery was only half the nightmare. The Soviets also unleashed their BM-13 Katyusha rocket launchers, terrifyingly nicknamed Stalin organs by the Germans because of the howling shriek the rockets made when fired. A single Katyusha truck could ripple-fire 16 132mm rockets in under 10 seconds. They were highly inaccurate, but accuracy was irrelevant when you were saturating a grid square. When a full battery of Katyushas fired, hundreds of rockets slammed into the German lines simultaneously, covering an area the size of 3 football fields in a blanket of fire and high-explosive shock waves. It is the exact same saturation fire principle the United States military would later perfect with the MLRS system during Operation Desert Storm, but executed half a century earlier with raw, unguided industrial fury. How do you maintain unit cohesion when the ground you are standing on is literally boiling with explosions? The brutal answer is, you do not. German communications wire was instantly shredded. Platoon commanders were vaporized. The frontline battalions of Army Group Center were effectively decapitated and blinded before they even fired a single shot in return. While the artillery pounded the front lines into dust, a secondary, invisible front had already been opened in the deep German rear. We cannot talk about Operation Bagration without analyzing the most devastating asymmetric warfare campaign of the 20th century. Behind the German lines, in the dense forests and swamps of Belarus, over 140,000 Soviet partisans had been waiting for the signal. On the night of June 19th, just days before the main offensive, they launched a massive coordinated sabotage campaign known as the Concert of Explosions. In a single night, partisan demolition teams planted and detonated over 40,000 explosive charges on the German railway network. They blew up bridges, derailed supply trains, and severed the telegraph lines connecting the German Feste Plätze, or fortress cities, to the high command in East Prussia. Compare this to the heroic efforts of the French resistance, cutting wires and blowing tracks before D-Day. The French resistance was a scalpel, surgically disrupting German movements. The Soviet partisans were a sledgehammer, completely shattering the logistical spine of an entire army group. German reserve units, desperately needed at the front, were suddenly stranded on derailed trains 50 miles away. Ammunition depots were cut off. Army Group Center was paralyzed right as the fatal blow was landing. When the artillery fire finally lifted and rolled forward, the Soviet infantry and armor surged into the smoke. We are going to examine the northern sector first, focusing on the heavily fortified city of Vitebsk. This was the anchor of the German 3rd Panzer Army, commanded by Colonel General Georg Hans Reinhardt. Vitebsk was defended by the 53rd Army Corps under General Friedrich Gollwitzer, a force of about 30,000 men ordered by Hitler to hold the city to the last bullet. Attacking them was the Soviet 1st Baltic Front under General Ivan Bagration and the 3rd Belarusian Front under the brilliant 38-year-old General Ivan Chernyakhovsky. Chernyakhovsky was the youngest front commander in the Red Army, a master of aggressive, high-tempo mechanized maneuver. He did not waste his armor throwing it directly at the concrete bunkers of Vitebsk. Instead, he utilized the classic deep battle doctrine. He found the seams in the German lines north and south of the city, areas held by exhausted, under-strength infantry divisions. Chernyakhovsky spearheaded his assault with the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, utilizing the heavily upgraded T-34-85 medium tanks. Inside these machines, the conditions were hellish. In the summer heat of Belarus, temperatures inside the steel hull could easily exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with the choking stench of diesel fuel, sweat, and cordite from the main gun. The crews were deafened by the roar of the V12 engine and the clanking of the tracks. But they drove with a relentless, suicidal momentum. They bypassed the German strongpoints entirely, pouring through the gaps and driving deep into the rear. To counter this armored flood, the Germans relied on their standard anti-tank weapon, the PaK-40 75mm towed gun. The PaK-40 was a superb weapon, capable of destroying a T-34 at combat ranges, but it was a towed gun, meaning it lacked mobility. Once the Soviet tanks broke through the linear defense and got behind the anti-tank screens, the German gunners were completely defenseless. By June 24th, just 2 days into the offensive, Chernikovsky and Bagration had closed the pincers behind Vitebsk. General Golitzer and his entire 53rd Army Corps were completely surrounded. Hitler demanded they stand fast and fight to the death to tie down Soviet forces. Are you starting to see the fatal flaw in rigid, static defense against a highly mobile, mechanized enemy? By turning Vitebsk into a fortress, Hitler had built his own men a concrete tomb. While the encirclement of Vitebsk was unfolding in the north, an even more spectacular operational masterpiece was happening in the southern sector, near the city of Bobruisk. This sector was commanded by General Konstantin Rokossovsky, leading the massive First Belarusian Front. Rokossovsky was a survivor. He had been tortured by Stalin's secret police during the purges, had all his teeth knocked out, and was later pulled from a gulag to save the Red Army. He understood the brutal calculus of war better than almost anyone. Facing him was the German Ninth Army under General Hans Jordan. Jordan felt relatively secure because his southern flank was anchored by the Pripyat marshes, a vast, impenetrable swamp that no mechanized army could cross. Or so the German field manuals claimed. This is where the Soviet mastery of combat engineering and terrain manipulation completely broke the German tactical model. Rokossovsky did not attack where the ground was firm and the German anti-tank guns were waiting. He chose to push his massive 65th Army, commanded by General Pavel Batov, straight through the swamps. For weeks leading up to the attack, Soviet combat engineers, working in chest-deep muck, had been constructing corduroy roads. They cut down thousands of pine trees, stripped the branches, and laid the logs side by side across the bogs, pinning them down with wooden stakes. They wove massive carpets out of branches and brushwood. When the offensive launched, the Germans were horrified to see entire brigades of 32-ton T-34 tanks and heavy ISU 152 assault guns literally floating over the mud, supported by thousands of American-built Studebaker trucks hauling fuel and ammunition. It was an engineering miracle that evokes comparisons to George Washington crossing the icy Delaware to surprise the Hessians at Trenton, but scaled up to involve thousands of armored vehicles and hundreds of thousands of men. The German Ninth Army was caught completely off guard, their southern flank dissolved in hours. As the Soviet tanks broke into the open ground behind the German lines, they called in the Red Air Force to finish the job. The skies over Belarus darkened with swarms of Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovix. The Sturmovik was arguably the most effective close air support aircraft of the Second World War. It was essentially a flying tank. The pilot sat inside a heavily armored steel bathtub that protected the engine, the cockpit, and the fuel tanks from ground fire. German infantrymen firing their MG-42 machine guns at the Sturmovik watched in despair as their armor-piercing rounds simply bounced off the aircraft fuselage. The Sturmoviks were armed with 23mm cannons and, more devastatingly, hundreds of P-Tabe anti-tank bomblets. These were small 3.3-pound shaped charges. A single Sturmovik could drop over 200 of these bomblets in a single pass, blanketing a German armoured column. When a P-Tabe hit the thin top armour of a German Panzer IV or a half-track, the shaped charge would burn a jet of superheated metal straight through the roof, detonating the ammunition inside and instantly incinerating the crew. The German Ninth Army, desperately trying to retreat from Bobruisk, was caught in massive traffic jams on the narrow dirt roads. The Sturmoviks descended on these columns like wolves on sheep. The roads became a slaughterhouse of burning vehicles, dead horses, and shattered men. The German commander, Field Marshal Ernst Busch, was paralyzed by the speed of the collapse. His headquarters was overwhelmed with frantic radio calls from division commanders, reporting that Soviet tanks were already 20 miles behind them. Busch begged Hitler for permission to order a general retreat, to pull Army Group Center back to a defensible line along the Berezina River. Hitler, operating from his bunker in East Prussia and completely detached from the tactical reality, flatly refused. He reiterated his Feste Plätze order. Every unit was to hold its ground. This catastrophic micromanagement sealed the fate of 28 German divisions. The elastic defense doctrine, which relied on giving up ground to buy time and setting up armored counterattacks, was completely abandoned. The Soviet spearheads, moving at 30 miles a day thanks to their American trucks, simply drove around the German strongpoints, cutting off their supply lines and leaving them to wither and die. By June 27th, less than a week into the offensive, the entire front line of Army Group Center had ceased to exist. Vitebsk had fallen, and General Golvitzer was marching into captivity with the survivors of his corps. Bobruisk was completely surrounded, trapping another 40,000 men of the German Ninth Army. In the center, Soviet forces had crossed the Dnieper River and captured Orsha and Mogilev. The outer crust of the German defense was utterly pulverized. But the Soviet operational plan, Deep Battle, was not about just taking the border cities. It was about total annihilation of the enemy force. The spearheads of Bagration, Cherniakovsky, and Rokossovsky were now converging from the north, east, and south. Their target was the Belarusian capital of Minsk, located deep in the German rear. The surviving remnants of the German Fourth Army and Ninth Army, over 100,000 men who had managed to escape the initial encirclements, were now running for their lives, trying to reach Minsk before the Soviet trap snapped shut. They were exhausted, out of ammunition, and constantly harassed by partisans and ground attack aircraft. They were marching into a bottleneck, a kill zone of unprecedented proportions. The race to Minsk was not a tactical retreat, but a desperate, chaotic stampede for survival. The remnants of the German Fourth Army and Ninth Army, numbering over 100,000 men, were funneling into a rapidly closing corridor east of the Belarusian capital. Their path was bisected by the Berezina River, a formidable natural obstacle that has haunted military commanders for over a century. If this scenario sounds familiar to students of history, it is because this was the exact same river where Napoleon Bonaparte lost the remnants of his Grand Army during his disastrous retreat from Russia in 1812. History was not just repeating itself, it was rhyming, with a horrifying, mechanized crescendo. The German engineers frantically tried to construct pontoon bridges across the muddy waters, but the Soviet Air Force gave them no quarter. Swarms of Sturmovix relentlessly bombed and strafed the crossing points. The riverbanks became a graveyard of burning half-tracks, shattered artillery pieces, and bloated corpses. German soldiers, stripped of their discipline by sheer terror, fought each other for a spot on the few remaining rafts, while others simply tried to swim across the treacherous currents and drowned under the weight of their own gear. While the German infantry bled at the river crossings, the Soviet armored pincers were closing the trap. On July 3rd, the Soviet Fifth Guards Tank Army, driving hard from the north, linked up with the First Guards Tank Corps, pushing up from the south. The steel jaws of Operation Bagration snapped shut just west of Minsk. Inside this massive pocket were over 100,000 German soldiers, representing the bulk of what was left of Army Group Center. They were completely cut off from supply, devoid of air support, and critically low on ammunition. The German High Command, finally realizing the apocalyptic scale of the disaster, fired Field Marshal Ernst Busch and replaced him with Field Marshal Walter Model. Model was known as the Führer fireman, a master of defensive warfare who had stabilized broken fronts before. But how do you command an army that no longer physically exists? Model arrived at his new headquarters, looked at the situation maps, and realized he was commanding ghost divisions. He was ordering counterattacks with panzer regiments that had already been reduced to burning scrap metal days earlier. The liquidation of the Minsk pocket was a textbook execution of Soviet deep battle doctrine. The Soviets did not bother trying to starve the Germans out. They simply tightened the noose with relentless artillery barrages and armored thrusts, carving the massive pocket into smaller, isolated fragments. Desperate German commanders ordered suicide breakout attempts. At night, thousands of German soldiers, many armed only with bayonets and entrenching tools, charged the Soviet lines in a blind panic, hoping to break through to the west. They were mowed down by heavy machine gun fire and point-blank artillery blasts. By July 11th, the Minsk pocket had been completely eradicated. Over 70,000 German soldiers were killed, and another 35,000 were taken prisoner. The city of Minsk itself, which had been under brutal Nazi occupation for 3 years, was liberated, though it was nothing more than a smouldering ruin. To fully grasp the magnitude of this victory, we have to look beyond the tactical movements and analyze the multi-dimensional warfare that made it possible. We have to look at the logistics, the intelligence, and the political theatre. Logistically, pushing an army of 2.5 million men forward at a rate of 10 to 15 miles a day is an absolute nightmare. The Soviet supply lines were stretching to their breaking point. This is where the unsung heroes of the Red Army, the railway troops, performed miracles. The standard Russian railway gauge is wider than the standard European gauge used in Germany and Poland. As the Soviets advanced into territory previously captured by the Germans, they had to physically rip up and relay thousands of miles of track under constant threat of partisan mines and leftover unexploded ordnance. Without this massive engineering effort, and without the endless fleet of American Lend-Lease trucks ferrying supplies from the railheads to the frontline tanks, the offensive would have culminated weeks earlier. It is a stark reminder that amateurs talk about tactics, but professionals study logistics. From an intelligence perspective, Operation Bagration remains one of the most stunning deceptions in military history. The German intelligence apparatus was completely blinded by its own arrogance and confirmation bias. They believed the Soviets were incapable of launching a massive, complex offensive through the swamps of Belarus. They wanted to believe the attack was coming in the south, so they ignored every piece of evidence to the contrary. We can draw a direct parallel here to the American intelligence failure prior to the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. In the Ardennes forest, American commanders looked at the harsh, snowy terrain and assumed the Germans could never launch a major armored offensive through it. They ignored the reports of tank engine noises in the woods, attributing them to localized movements. Both the Germans at Bagration and the Americans at the Bulge fell victim to the exact same cognitive trap, which is assuming the enemy will only do what your own manuals say is logical. The difference is that the American army was able to absorb the blow, adapt, and crush the German offensive. Army Group Center was simply vaporized. The political ramifications of Bagration were just as explosive as the artillery barrages. By mid-July, the Western Allies were bogged down in the hedgerows of Normandy, measuring their daily advances in yards. The American and British press were starting to wonder if the invasion had stalled. Joseph Stalin, a master of political theatre, decided to send a very clear message to Washington and London about who was doing the heavy lifting in this war. On July 17, 1944, Stalin ordered 57,000 German prisoners of war captured during the encirclement of Minsk to be marched through the streets of Moscow. They were led by 19 captured German generals, still wearing their medals and uniforms. The prisoners were marched in absolute silence, broken only by the shuffling of their boots. Behind them drove a fleet of street sweepers, literally washing the streets clean to symbolize the removal of fascist filth from Soviet soil. It was a brutal, humiliating spectacle designed to prove to the world that the Soviet Union was not just surviving, but systematically destroying the greatest military machine Europe had ever seen. When we analyze the strategic lessons of Operation Bagration, the most glaring takeaway is the absolute strategic bankruptcy of Adolf Hitler. Feste, Plätze, or fortified places doctrine, by ordering his armies to hold ground at all costs and turning cities into static fortresses, Hitler stripped the German army of its only remaining advantage, which was tactical mobility. Static defense against a highly mobile, well-supplied enemy is a recipe for annihilation. We have seen this exact same fatal error throughout military history. Look at the American Civil War, specifically the Siege of Vicksburg in 1863. Confederate General John Pemberton allowed his army to be trapped inside the fortress city of Vicksburg by Ulysses S. Grant. By giving up his mobility, Pemberton doomed his entire army to slow starvation and eventual surrender, splitting the Confederacy in two. Or look at the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, anchoring themselves in a valley fortress, completely underestimating the enemy ability to bring heavy artillery through impassable jungle terrain. Hitler made the exact same mistake on a continental scale. He built fortresses out of paper and expected them to hold back a hurricane of steel. The final tally of Operation Bagration defies comprehension. In just 6 weeks, the Soviet Union advanced over 400 miles, reaching the Vistula River right outside of Warsaw, Poland. They completely obliterated 28 German divisions. German casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured, exceeded 400,000 men. It was a loss of manpower and equipment that Nazi Germany could never replace. Army Group Center, the shield that protected the route to Berlin, was gone. The Red Army had torn a hole in the Eastern Front so massive that the entire German defensive structure began to collapse inward. Bagration proved that the Soviet military had fully matured. They had taken the devastating deep battle theories of the 1930s, combined them with American logistical muscle, and forged a weapon of unparalleled destruction. The road to Berlin was now wide open, and the final, bloody act of the Second World War was about to begin. War is rarely decided by who has the most courage, but rather by who has the logistical capacity to sustain violence longer than the enemy can endure it. When an army loses its mobility and its ability to adapt, it ceases to be a fighting force and simply becomes a target. Now I want to hear from you in the comments below. Which factor do you believe was the most critical to the Soviet success in Operation Bagration? Was it A, the massive artillery and armored superiority? Was it B, the Maskirovka deception campaign that blinded German intelligence? Or was it C, the American Lend-Lease trucks that provided the logistical mobility? Drop your answer and your reasoning in the comments, and I will see you in the next analysis.